What happens when the neighborhood bully is also the HOA president? In Clearwater Shores, one man's quiet stand against a tyrannical leader sparked a chain of events that exposed corruption, shattered power, and changed a community forever. This is the story of how one brave neighbor took back their freedom and took down the Clipboard queen. Let's begin the story. The furious knocking on Ethan Cross's front door rattled the very air inside his sleek, modern lakeside home. His coffee cup trembled against the granite countertop, sending tiny ripples across the surface like a seismic warning. It was barely 7 o'clock a.m. on a foggy Saturday, and the last thing Ethan expected was a surprise visitor, let alone the kind that could make the birds scatter from the trees outside. Still wearing his faded flannel pajama pants and a t-shirt, Ethan shuffled to the door, blinking away sleep. The moment he cracked it open, the nightmare standing on his doorstep nearly made him laugh. Karen, the dreaded president of the Clearwater Shores HOA, stood there like a vengeful statue draped in her signature blazing purple pantsuit. A neon clipboard clutched so tightly to her chest it seemed welded to her ribcage. Flanking her were two security officers, glorified HOA volunteers who wore black tactical vests to sizes too large and mirrored sunglasses, trying desperately to look intimidating. Without so much as a good morning, Karen stabbed a manicured finger toward Ethan's chest. "We've received multiple serious noise complaints about your property, and we demand immediate access to your garage for inspection," she barked, her voice slicing through the misty morning air like a razor. Ethan blinked once, then twice, wondering if he was still trapped in a dream. Noise complaints? He hadn't even flipped a single switch yet this morning. His house sat quiet as a tomb. From behind Karen, several of the more curious neighbors peeked through their manicured hedges, smartphones already raised, desperate for their first scandal of the weekend. With deliberate slowness, Ethan leaned against the doorframe, letting a crooked, lazy smile stretch across his face, the kind of smile designed to set control freaks like Karen ablaze with rage. "I'm sorry," Ethan said with exaggerated politeness, "but you're not coming into my garage. This is private property, and you have no right." For a split second, Karen looked as though Ethan had slapped her. Her face twisted, her mouth flapping uselessly like a fish dumped onto dry land. Her goons shifted nervously, clearly unsure if they were supposed to storm the house or wait for orders. Ethan could almost hear the gears grinding in Karen's paranoid brain, imagining wild illegal fantasies, hidden drugs, black market weapons, an underground casino. The reality, of course, was far beyond anything she could guess. Inside that garage sat a classified mobile surveillance center, part of a joint task force operation Ethan was assisting. FBI encrypted comms, soundproof recording chambers, surveillance drawn as things Karen wouldn't recognize if they hit her square between the eyes. Still smiling, Ethan slowly and firmly closed the door in her stunned face. Through the peephole, he watched as Karen furiously scribbled some absurd violation notice onto her clipboard, her lips moving in furious mutters. "If he won't let us in," she hissed to her minions, "we'll find another way. He's hiding something. I know it." And at that chilling moment, Ethan knew the real game had only just begun. By the time Ethan Cross finished his second cup of coffee, the Clearwater Shores neighborhood group chat was already on fire. Karen, ever the master manipulator, had wasted no time. She had posted a cryptic, alarming message that made it sound like Ethan was running some kind of clandestine operation out of his garage, a vague warning for residents to stay vigilant and report any unusual activity immediately. Ethan chuckled as he scrolled through the panicked replies. "Should we call the sheriff? Is it drugs?" I knew he was up to something. Outside, he could see Mrs. Fenwick across the street pretending to sweep her driveway, her phone awkwardly pointed toward his house. Two teenage boys on bikes circled slowly like hungry sharks, peeking curiously at his fenced backyard. The buzz of suspicion was almost tangible, like a low, anxious hum vibrating through the entire lakeside community. Still, Ethan wasn't worried. His garage, the so-called source of suspicious activity, hadn't made a whisper of noise in weeks. The specialized surveillance equipment inside was state-of-the-art. Ultra-quiet servers, soundproofed walls, electromagnetic shielding. Even the smallest vibrations were contained, making it one of the most silent structures in Clearwater Shores. But if Karen couldn't find proof, she would invent it. Ethan knew her type, the self-appointed protector who needed a villain to justify her crusade. She would not stop until she either got inside that garage or drove him out. That evening, as a crimson sunset bled across the sky, Ethan noticed a small gathering across the cul-de-sac. Karen and her inner circle, Donnie, an overzealous HOA enforcer with a beer gut and an inferiority complex, and Becca, an aspiring Instagram influencer who treated HOA citations like badges of honor, were huddled together in whispered conversation, stealing glances toward Ethan's house between furtive exchanges. Ethan stepped out onto his porch, setting a watering can dramatically next to his potted hibiscus, pretending not to notice them. From his concealed cameras hidden inside decorative lanterns, he zoomed in on their animated discussion. He caught snippets of their fevered conversation. Illegal operation. Violating HOA codes. Right to inspect. At one point, Donnie even pulled a pair of bolt cutters out of a duffel bag and held them up like a kid showing off a new toy. Ethan nearly snorted his coffee through his nose. Bolt cutters, really? Were they planning to bust in like cartoon bandits? What they couldn't realize was that Ethan's property was protected by more than just sturdy locks. He had motion-activated cameras hidden in the landscaping, a silent alarm wired directly to Clearwater County's FBI liaison office, and encrypted sensors monitoring every inch of the perimeter. If they dared step 1 foot onto his land without permission, it wouldn't be a petty HOA matter anymore. It would become a full-blown federal incident. Ethan leaned back in his Adirondack chair, the humid breeze rustling through the nearby oaks. His lips curled into a slow, predatory grin. Let them come, he thought. Let them walk themselves straight into the lion's den. And judging by the glint of steel in Donnie's hand and the manic gleam in Karen's eyes, it wouldn't be long now. The night settled over Clearwater Shores like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The once glowing windows flickered off one by one until the street lay bathed only in the dim orange glow of antique-style lamplights. Ethan Cross sat silently in his darkened living room, his laptop balanced on his knees, the live security feeds from his property open on the screen like a private movie premiere. He didn't have to wait long. At exactly 12:16 a.m., 3 shadowy figures crept into frame, scuttling across his manicured lawn like oversized cockroaches. Karen led the charge, her neon purple jacket now swapped out for an all-black stealth outfit that still managed to somehow sparkle under the streetlights. Behind her bumbled Donnie, bolt cutters slung awkwardly over one shoulder, and Becca, who tiptoed theatrically like a bad extra in a community theater production. Ethan leaned forward, his heart hammering in his chest, not with fear, but with pure, electric anticipation. Perimeter breach detected. Level 1 protocols activated. The silent alert flashed in the corner of his laptop screen. The crosstown, a matching alert silently pinged the Clearwater County FBI Dispatch Center. Down by the side gate, Karen pressed her ear dramatically to the metal latch like she was auditioning for Mission Impossible. HOA Edition. She whispered frantically to Donnie, who grunted and pulled the bolt cutters into position. With an awkward squeeze and a muted snap, the lock gave way, falling to the ground with a pathetic clatter. They froze for a second, glancing around like kids caught raiding a cookie jar. But the street remained silent. Inside his living room, Ethan smirked. They were in, and the trap was set. On the security feed, Ethan watched them huddle at his heavy garage door, struggling with the industrial-grade padlock. Karen kicked it in frustration, cursing under her breath. Becca fumbled with a cheap walkie-talkie, whispering nonsense into it like she was coordinating a tactical assault. And then, sirens. The night erupted into a blaze of flashing red and blue. 2 blacked-out SUVs roared up from opposite ends of the street, tires squealing. Federal agents in tactical vests poured out like a swarm of hornets, weapons drawn but controlled, shouting commands that shattered the stillness. Down. Hands where we can see them. Karen screamed a shrill, panicked screech that echoed off the quiet lakeside homes. Donnie dropped the bolt cutters and immediately dropped flat into Ethan's flower bed. Becca, in a comical moment of pure terror, froze with her hands above her head, the walkie-talkie still dangling limply from her wrist. Ethan rose slowly from his chair, stretching his arms like a man waking from a good nap. He took a lazy sip of his now cold coffee, savoring the chaos, and casually made his way to the front door. As he stepped outside, he caught sight of Karen, wide-eyed and shaking, being shoved into a pair of silver handcuffs on his perfectly manicured lawn. One of the lead agents, Agent Ramirez, nodded respectfully at Ethan. "Thanks for your cooperation, Mr. Cross. We've got it from here." Ethan returned the nod, hiding a wicked grin behind his coffee cup. Across the street, curious neighbors peeked through blinds and around hedges. The legendary showdown had begun and Clearwater Shores would never forget it. By sunrise, Clearwater Shores felt like a town sitting atop a live wire. Word of Karen's late-night arrest had spread faster than the morning fog off the lake. By the time Ethan Cross opened his blinds to let in the gold-pink light of dawn, he saw it, people strolling past his house much slower than usual. Dogs being walked back and forth suspiciously often, golf carts idling a little too long across the street. Ethan smirked and took a leisurely sip of his coffee. The circus had come to town. The private neighborhood Facebook group once filled with cookie recipes and lost cat notices had exploded overnight into a feeding frenzy of gossip, speculation, and not-so-subtle finger-pointing. Was that really Karen in cuffs? I always knew something shady was going on. Maybe Ethan's a secret agent. Ethan leaned back in his chair and scrolled through the endless stream of wild theories. Some thought he was running an underground casino. Others whispered about illegal radio towers, secret labs, and even government witness protection scenarios. Every hour, the rumors got juicier, more ludicrous. And Ethan wasn't about to correct them. He responded to every nosy private message with a simple emoji. Meanwhile, the visible damage to Karen's reputation was as catastrophic as a hurricane. Her manicured image, the queen bee of Clearwater Shores, the iron-fisted enforcer of mailbox colors and grass blade lengths, had been obliterated in a single night. Clips had already leaked from people's security cameras, grainy footage of Karen being led away in handcuffs, her shriek of "I'm the HOA President, I have rights," becoming the newest meme material. One video, zoomed in on Donnie's faceplant into Ethan's rose bushes, had racked up hundreds of shares by mid-morning, complete with laughing emoji reactions and snarky captions like "Clearwater Shores Tactical Squad in action." But even as the gossip crackled like wildfire, Ethan remained cool, composed, the eye of the hurricane. He knew Karen wasn't done. Someone like her didn't accept defeat easily. She wouldn't let go of her imagined authority without a final, desperate gasp. Ethan could already picture it, a new plot brewing behind closed doors, a frantic scheme hatched to salvage her crumbling reign. And he was right. Late that afternoon, as Ethan pruned the hibiscus by his front walkway purely for show, since he was actually monitoring his cameras through discreet smart glasses, he spotted her. Karen, lurking at the far end of the cul-de-sac like a wounded animal, massive sunglasses hiding her swollen eyes, clipboard clutched at her side like a security blanket. Her movements were jerky, twitchy, full of pent-up rage barely restrained. And beside her were her last remaining loyalists, Becca and Donnie, looking a little worse for wear but still stupidly loyal. They weren't done. Ethan smiled slightly, snipping a flower stem with a satisfying clip. If Karen wanted a rematch, he was ready. And this time, it wouldn't just be embarrassment she'd be facing. It would be obliteration. The air in Clearwater Shores was thick with tension, heavier even than the dense humidity rolling off the lake. From his living room, Ethan Cross watched the next act of the unfolding disaster begin. Across the cul-de-sac, in the backyard of Donnie's oversized, cookie-cutter house, a secret gathering was brewing. Ethan, of course, knew all about it, not because he was snooping, but because he had a little help. His neighbor Rachel, a no-nonsense woman who had zero patience for HOA drama, happened to live right next door and had a front-row seat to the entire debacle. Rachel's texts buzzed across Ethan's screen like excited dispatches from the front lines. Karen's cooking something up. They're talking about credible threats and emergency action. Donnie just pulled out a freaking police scanner. Ethan leaned back in his chair and shook his head, laughing under his breath. Karen wasn't just doubling down, she was tripling down. According to Rachel's overheard snippets, Karen had concocted an even more absurd narrative. She now claimed that Ethan was running an illegal broadcast center that was interfering with emergency services. A federal offense, she breathlessly told her tiny audience, one that would surely force the authorities to arrest Ethan if they could just gather evidence themselves first. It was laughable. The reality was, Ethan's equipment wasn't even remotely capable of jamming emergency frequencies. Everything inside his garage was professionally shielded, perfectly legal, and approved by federal agencies. But Karen wasn't interested in facts. She was building a lifeboat out of paranoia and stupidity, and dragging her dwindling crew along for the ride. As dusk settled over Clearwater Shores, Ethan prepared himself. He adjusted the sensitivity on the hidden motion sensors. He recalibrated the silent alarm linked directly to Agent Ramirez's FBI team. And, just for fun, he repositioned a few hidden cameras to ensure he would capture every ridiculous second of the inevitable operation. He didn't have to wait long. Just after 11 p.m., Athens' security monitors flickered with movement. Through the infrared lenses, he saw them Karen, Donnie, and Becca, creeping like amateurs through the moonlit shadows. This time, they carried a battered handheld signal jammer, a borrowed police radio, and a cheap frequency scanner that looked like it had been ordered off a sketchy website for $39.99. Donnie clutched the scanner like it was some sacred relic, waving it toward Ethan's girls like a magical divining rod. From the live feed, Ethan could see Karen barking orders in loud whispers, her desperation leaking out of every frantic gesture. They thought they were being stealthy. In reality, they were lighting themselves up like Christmas trees on Athens' security grid. Motion sensors clicked silently to life. Infrared lasers mapped their movements. Cameras hidden in lawn ornaments whirred softly, recording every pathetic step. Ethan smiled, savoring the moment. If their first break-in was stupidity, this one was suicidal. Because this time, they weren't just trespassing. They were committing federal crimes. And the hammer was about to fall even harder. The clock on Ethan Cross's wall ticked to 11:23 p.m. when the final piece fell into place. The instant Karen's makeshift surveillance squad crossed the hidden tripwire sensors near the garage, the system activated. Perimeter breach detected. Level 2 protocols initiated. Ethan calmly tapped a single button on his laptop. Across Clearwater Shores, the silent alarm pinged at the Clearwater County FBI field office. And then, all hell broke loose. Down the quiet, sleepy street, black SUVs materialized out of the night, engines rumbling like beasts waking from slumber. Their headlights snapped on all at once, high beams slicing through the darkness. Within seconds, agents poured out faster, sharper, more forceful than during the first raid. Their vests gleamed under the streetlights, radios crackling, weapons drawn in a show of controlled but overwhelming power. Federal agents, freeze, hands up. The cul-de-sac lit up like the 4th of July. Sirens, floodlights, flashing red and blue everywhere. Karen shrieked, the sound so high-pitched that Ethan winced even from inside his house. She tried to bolt truly, pathetically tried, but her foot snagged on one of the solar lights Ethan had deliberately placed along his driveway. She face-planted spectacularly, her phone skittering across the lawn like a dropped weapon. Becca stumbled backward into a hedge, while Donnie froze in terror, lifting the illegal signal jammer above his head like it was an offering to angry gods. The agents moved in fast. Karen was yanked roughly to her feet, her clothes streaked with grass stains and dirt, wild hair sticking out from under a too small baseball cap she must have thought would make her inconspicuous. You're under arrest for unlawful surveillance, trespassing, tampering with federal communications equipment, and obstruction of justice, Agent Ramirez said coolly, cuffing her without even a hint of sympathy. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a gasping fish. This is harassment. This is oppression. I'm trying to protect my community, she screeched, her voice bouncing off the nearby houses. You're interfering with federal operations, ma'am, Ramirez answered sharply. That's not protecting your community. That's committing felonies. Behind her, Donnie and Becca were being cuffed to Donnie still whining about how he didn't know the jammer was illegal and Becca sobbing dramatically about losing her influencer sponsorships. Ethan finally stepped out onto his porch, arms crossed casually over his chest. He locked eyes with Karen as the agents hustled her toward one of the waiting SUVs. The pure, incandescent hatred blazing in her glare almost made him laugh almost. Ramirez caught Ethan's gaze and gave a subtle nod. Good job. We've got this. As the SUVs disappeared into the night, Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension of the last few weeks finally starting to unravel. It was over. Or so he thought. Because what was about to happen next would ignite Clearwater Shores into a wildfire of scandals, betrayals, and the kind of chaos no whole meeting minutes could ever hope to contain. By the next morning, Clearwater Shores resembled less a pristine gated community and more a small town rattled by scandal. Neighbors huddled in driveways, whispered behind freshly clipped hedges, and pretended to casually walk their dogs while exchanging frantic gossip. Ethan Cross didn't even try to hide his amusement as he sipped his coffee on the porch. He barely opened the news app before seeing it. HOA President arrested for federal crimes during midnight break-in. The headline blared across every local outlet, accompanied by grainy security footage of Karen face-planting into Ethan's flower bed, her shriek frozen mid-scream. By noon, the memes were out of control. A photoshopped image of Karen with mission failed flashing behind her. Another of Donnie and Becca dressed like failed burglars with the caption, "Clearwater's most wanted for crimes against common sense." The damage was irreversible. Inside the fortified clubhouse where Karen had once ruled like a queen, the remaining HOA board members scrambled like rats on a sinking ship. 3 board members, including Donnie, submitted frantic resignation emails before lunch citing personal reasons and the need to prioritize family. Even Linda, who had once proudly seconded every absurd motion Karen proposed including the infamous no flamingos on lawns policy, was nowhere to be found. Her house suddenly sporting a hastily placed for sale sign. An emergency hall meeting was called for that very evening. The usually sterile, half-empty conference room was packed wall-to-wall with angry residents, many of whom Ethan had never seen at a meeting before. Some came dragging lawn chairs and coolers, as if attending a public execution. Ethan, casual in jeans and a t-shirt, sat quietly in the back, enjoying every second. The acting HOA president, a weaselly man named Harold Bixby, stood at the podium, sweating profusely. He stammered through a pitiful attempt at damage control, blaming miscommunication and misunderstandings for the chaos. It didn't work. One by one, furious residents stood up to voice years of pent-up rage. Why was Karen allowed in check power for so long? How much of our HOA fees went to funding her personal vendettas? Where was the oversight? A retired judge who lived to streets over slammed down a binder the size of a small boulder, a personal record of 5 years' worth of frivolous fines and absurd citations. And then, like a cherry on top of a flaming disaster cake, Agent Ramirez himself walked into the meeting, wearing casual jeans but with his FBI badge displayed plainly around his neck. The room fell so silent Ethan could hear the ticking of Harold's cheap wristwatch. Ramirez spoke with slow, deliberate authority. "We have opened investigations into illegal activities conducted by members of this HOA board under the direction of Karen Whitmore. Participation, concealment, or aiding these activities may result in federal charges." Several people paled visibly. One man stood up and left without a word, his chair spinning behind him. Ramirez finished with a simple bombshell. "I strongly recommend you dissolve this board immediately and hold fresh elections under federal oversight." The tension exploded into chaos, shouts, accusations, furious arguments. It was total, beautiful collapse. Ethan simply leaned back in his chair, hands folded behind his head, smiling as the empire Karen had spent years building burned itself to the ground in one glorious, fiery implosion. And he hadn't even had to lift a finger. The very next morning, Clearwater Shores felt like a battlefield after the war. The HOA's iron grip had shattered, and the residents, who once cowered under Karen's rule, were now wide awake, alive with new energy. Neighbors who had barely nodded to each other before now gathered openly in driveways, porches, and sidewalks, swapping more stories, laughing at the absurdity, and plotting what to do next. At the heart of it all sat Ethan Cross, the reluctant catalyst who had, without firing a single shot, dismantled the dictatorship that had ruled their quiet lakeside paradise. It started small. Someone suggested an emergency cookout that weekend, a kind of unofficial freedom celebration. Flyers were distributed hastily, most handwritten, inviting every resident to bring a dish and a smile. The phrase "leave your clipboards at home" scrawled at the bottom in bold red letters. But it wasn't just about burgers and lemonade. It was about taking their neighborhood back. Meanwhile, the now former HOA board was imploding in full public view. Linda was spotted driving out of the neighborhood with her car packed to the ceiling. Harold tried to quietly delete old emails and Facebook posts tying him to Karen's schemes, but, of course, the FBI already had it all. Rumors swirled that a few desperate ex-board members were trying to convince the city to intervene and restore order. They were laughed out of every office they contacted. The city had no intention of lifting a finger, especially since they had quietly appointed Ethan as a civilian liaison, a subtle but powerful position meant to ensure that no HOA abuse would ever happen again under their watchful eyes. Ethan hadn't asked for the role, but when the city representative, a sharp-dressed man named Mr. Delaney, showed up with an official-looking certificate and a handshake, Ethan couldn't say no. "You've proven you know the stakes better than anyone," Delaney had said with a half-smile. "And frankly, you're the only one they trust right now." As he pinned the honorary badge inside a simple folder and tucked it under his arm, Ethan realized the truth. He hadn't just survived Karen's reign. He had become the insurance policy against it ever happening again. That Friday evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the lake in shimmering gold, Ethan stood on his front lawn. Coolers thudded open, children raced by on scooters, grills sizzled, laughter, real and free, rolled across the lawns. The block party was underway. Neighbors who once feared a $50 fine for leaving a trash can out 5 minutes too long now clinked beers and toasted each other's freedom. Someone even set up a peapod shaped like a giant clipboard, and when it finally burst open, tiny fake violation notices and candy rained down in a glorious storm. As night fell, and the fairy lights strung across Ethan's garage twinkled in the dark, he realized something profound. This wasn't just a celebration. It was a rebirth. Clearwater Shores had finally, gloriously, taken its first breath of real freedom, and it was sweeter than any HOA president's approval could ever hope to be. Karen Whitmore, once the unchallenged queen of Clearwater Shores, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered between neighbors over coffee and lawnmower engines. And her downfall wasn't just local news anymore. It was everywhere. By Saturday morning, Karen's disgrace had reached a fever pitch. Local TV stations replayed the footage of her being hauled away in cuffs on an endless loop. One particularly brutal video showed her face plant into Ethan's flower bed in slow motion, with dramatic music overlaid for full comedic effect. It went viral. Online memes crowned her the clipboard criminal, and even national outlets picked up the story. HOA tyrant exposed by undercover FBI operation. But while the world left, Karen's world collapsed. Stripped of her HOA title, buried under legal bills, and facing multiple felony charges, she tried desperately to negotiate. Her sweaty, exhausted lawyer struck a plea deal. Heavy fines, thousands of hours of community service, a permanent, court-ordered ban from holding any leadership position, HOA, political, or otherwise anywhere in the state. She had no real choice. If she went to trial, the mountain of evidence Ethan and the FBI had collected would bury her. Karen accepted the deal with the bitterness of a woman who still believed she was a victim. Even as she put on her neon orange vest and grabbed a litter stick to start picking up trash at public parks 2 counties over. The photos surfaced almost immediately. Karen hunched over, scowling at a patch of graffiti she had been ordered to scrub off a bus stop. Karen stooping into ditches to pick up beer cans, her once manicured hands covered in grime. Karen pretending not to notice passers-by gleefully snapping pictures from their car windows. It was poetic justice in its purest form. Back in Clearwater Shores, life continued to heal. Ethan's honorary role as community liaison meant he spent a few evenings each month helping mediate neighborhood concerns, but nothing remotely close to the ridiculous power trips Karen had indulged in. No more fines for flower colors. No more threats over how long trash cans sat curbside. No more clipboard tyranny. The garage that Karen had once believed hid some criminal conspiracy now stood open during neighborhood events, a quiet, impressive reminder that Ethan hadn't been hiding crime. He had been helping fight it. On Sunday afternoon, as Ethan grilled burgers at another backyard gathering, he overheard a group of residents joking about starting a No Karens Allowed club, a no HOA that would exist solely to ensure no one ever got that much power again. He couldn't help but laugh. Karen had thought she could control people with fear. Instead, she had created a community stronger than ever, bound not by petty rules, but by defiance, resilience, and a shared belief that no one should live in fear of a clipboard. And the best part, Karen's name would live on not as a badge of authority but as a warning. The evening air over Clearwater Shores shimmered with the golden haze of a block party in full swing. Music spilled from open garage doors. Laughter rolled across manicured lawns. Grills smoked, kids raced each other on scooters, and someone even set off a few low, polite fireworks over the lake, their reflections dancing across the rippling water. Ethan Cross stood near the makeshift stage in his backyard, the very garage Karen once tried so desperately to infiltrate, surrounded by faces that just weeks ago had barely dared to wave hello. Now, they were friends. Now, they were a community. It was strange to think how much had changed. For months, fear had ruled these streets. Fear of fines, fear of being called out for trivial violations, fear of standing out. Now that fear had evaporated, replaced by something stronger, something Karen had never understood: unity. As the last of the burgers sizzled and the kids lined up for ice cream bars, someone shoved a karaoke microphone into Ethan's hand and urged him to say a few words. He didn't plan a speech. He didn't need one. Standing under the twinkle lights strung between oaks and pergolas, Ethan looked out over the smiling crowd, neighbors he once barely knew, now cheering for him. He spoke simply, from the gut. "Sometimes the loudest bullies fall the hardest," he said, his voice carrying over the quiet. "And sometimes, when they do, they accidentally remind us of what really matters. It's not about who has the most rules. It's about looking out for each other, not lording over each other." The crowd erupted into real applause, not polite clapping, but raw, joyful cheering. "And if anyone ever tries to run this place like a dictatorship again," Ethan added with a grin, "they'll have to go through all of us first." The laughter and whistles that followed were loud enough to wake the sleeping egrets across the lake. Later that night, after the last sparkler fizzled out and the last lawn chair was folded, Ethan sat on his porch, sipping a well-earned beer. The soft hum of crickets filled the air. The street was peaceful. Across the way, Karen's old house stood dark and empty, already sold, already fading into a distant, almost laughable memory. But the neighborhood she had once terrorized had been reborn. Clearwater Shores had become a true community, not because of enforced uniformity, but because they had fought through chaos, exposed rot, and come out the other side stronger. Ethan smiled to himself as he glanced at the framed plaque hanging by his front door, the one the FBI agents had jokingly presented him. "Outstanding service in HOA counterintelligence." Sometimes, the quiet neighbor with the locked garage isn't the one you should fear. Sometimes, he's the one you should thank. And sometimes, all it takes to change everything is a little patience, a little courage, and a whole lot of underestimated grit. As the moon rose high over Clearwater Shores, Ethan leaned back in his chair, knowing one unshakable truth: the clipboard tyrants would never rule here again. Not on his watch. True community is not built through control or fear, it is built through trust, resilience, and standing up for what is right. Karen's downfall in Clearwater Shores is a powerful reminder that when authority is abused, it eventually collapses under the weight of its own arrogance. Those who seek to dominate others through petty rules, intimidation, and unchecked power will always be exposed, especially when ordinary people choose courage over compliance. Real leadership isn't about forcing others to obey. It's about protecting fairness, encouraging respect, and empowering others to thrive. Ethan's quiet strength shows that you don't need to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes, the most lasting change comes from patience, preparedness, and unwavering belief that no one is above the law. In any community, the strongest defense against tyranny isn't more rules, it's unity, integrity, and the willingness to stand together when it matters most.